Hello?
Checking.
Cool.
Yay!
Okay. Is that loud enough? Hi everyone, take two. I'm Diana. I'm going to talk about design systems and when and how much you need them. So for context, I work at GitHub and I'm the design systems lead there. We're quite a small team and we haven't been around for very long, about a year. We're modeled like an open source project with 3 core maintainers and 5 or 6 contributors that are spread across the org in engineering, product design, and creative and marketing. I just had a conversation outside the restrooms and realized that not everyone necessarily knows what a design system is, or we might have different interpretations of what that might be. So I figure I better start off with what are design systems and why we might want to use them before we get into the when and how much. So design systems aren't new. Some of you might be familiar with the NASA Graphics Standards Manual, which is quite an old design system, and that was printed, so it wasn't really like the code side of things. Some of you might have heard of Bootstrap and think of that when you think of design systems. Very popular, well-known HTML, CSS, JS framework. And then more recently, you might think of things like material design, which is a huge system that is used not only internally at Google, but for other developers and designers to use. So that can leave you sort of wondering, wait a minute, isn't that a CSS framework? Wasn't that a pattern library? What are all these different things? Are they the same thing or are they different? And so I think recently we've started to really coin the term design systems, and it's partly to do with things like this coming out, which is Salesforce's design system, and they use design system in the name, so that's really helpful. So we can go, oh, we can point at a thing and go, that's a design system. But I want to help explain a little bit more about what design systems are and what they are to me and what they are at GitHub. So to start with, a design system has rules, constraints, and principles, and they are implemented in design and code. So take color, for example. A rule might be that it must pass a color contrast ratio of 451, that a constraint could be the number of the colors in a palette, and a principle could be this color should be used in a meaningful way. A design implementation of that could be something like a flash message, an alert, an error message. And so in this example, the colors, the foreground and the background color pass, so you can read the text. The color red is part of our color palette, and it's being used in a meaningful way in our system. It's to express errors and danger and something's not right and gone wrong. In code, for us, that means that translates into how we define our Sass variables. So we might have a red color, and that is a set of red colors, and that's mapped to foreground, background, border colors. And then those kind of like variables that describe the function are then mapped to our styles, which we call utilities components, and unfortunately we also have a lot of custom styles, and I'll get into that a bit more later. But there's many parts to a system. So we've started by getting the sort of primitive layer defined, which is like typography, color, spacing. And on top of that, adding components which use typography, color, and spacing. And those components are used within page layouts, which could also be components. And then together, how do those things work? And that's where you need things like interaction models. And then there's the voice and tone and grammar and mechanics. Are you going to use title case or uppercase in your buttons? Don't use uppercase. You might, when you get that error message on GitHub, do you want it to be all like kind of fun, like, oh, whoops, something's gone wrong? Or are you like really panicking and you want the voice and tone to be like, just give me the information quickly. I don't have time for fun right now. So all of that stuff flows through the system. So a design system is independent parts, but they're all kind of like interrelated. They can affect each other. So if we take a button component, for example, that's a component itself that has typography, color, spacing. That button component can be used within other components, perhaps a form or an overlay or something. And that component can then be used in a page layout, which could also technically be a component if you like. And then how do those pages work with each other? When you click save on a form, like what happens? What's the feedback and messaging you get? So if we zoom out a little bit, right now this is like sort of how far we've gotten with design systems at GitHub. We have worked really hard on improving Primer CSS and making sure that that's based on systems. We're using that Primer CSS in our prototyping tools. And then we have Sketch UI kits that have those same styles for the graphic design part of the work. And then we have worked really hard on making sure all of that stuff is documented. And then we have some other things in play, like brand guidelines. So that's everything from like logo use to how do we use those same colors when it's in something like print, perhaps. We have some basic JS code style documentation, but it's not really connected with the rest of the system yet. We haven't figured out how we want to use CSS and JS together. And then we want to add on to that email and our native UI kit. We have a desktop app, and that's not really connected to the system yet. So this is what we're working towards, but we've got some work to do. So why do we need this? Why would we work on this type of thing? Why do we need design systems? At GitHub, when I joined, I wasn't starting from scratch. There had been a history of different iterations of style guides, and then in March 2015, they open sourced Primer, which they call a CSS framework. And so when I started at GitHub, I naturally wanted to, check out what the style guide looked like, what the CSS was like to work with. I'm a designer that likes to implement my own designs. One of the first things I noticed was that there was piles and piles of custom CSS inside the GitHub app, and it wasn't documented, and it wasn't part of Primer. And that made it really hard to know what the right styles were to use, and it made it really hard to update pages. They also didn't have real systems defined. There wasn't a clear scale around their spacing or a typography. And one of the worst things that I couldn't even fathom was that there was apparently no system really with their colors. I counted, not by hand. There's 2,449 hex values that were not connected in any way. And so that kind of seemed like a problem to me. That's not maintainable from a code standpoint, and doesn't make it very easy for anybody to use. So a group of us got together, a bunch of designers who working in different parts of the team, who had been sort of trying to tackle these problems from different areas. And we kind of felt like, well, our first priority is that we need to make this design development workflow better for our designers, and our designers are designers who code. So other companies might be the first thing we need to do is create a Sketch UI kit or a PSD file, because that's where our designers are starting. Our biggest pain point, because all of our designers implement their designs, was that design development workflow. So that's where we started. And then we have a lot of engineers that also work on the UI and implement stuff on the front end. And none of them really wanted to write CSS, and they were having to. So that was our goal to start with. So you may have heard of terms like functional CSS, atomic CSS. You may or may not like them. We started by introducing utilities, which are single-purpose classes that just do one thing only. And we base those on a system. So as an example of that, say take padding. Each utility was using a variable that mapped to our spacing scale. And when you're choosing these scales, you need to also think about how that system works. And so previously, a lot of GitHub was using padding and margin of 5 and 10 pixels, but that doesn't break down or add up very easily. So we tested out a few different scales, and we went with an 8 pixel based system. Other people might use something like a 16 base scale, but GitHub's quite dense. So when you're choosing systems and when you're designing systems, you not need to only think about like how does this stuff all work together, but what's right for the context of our own product. And then we worked on a typography scale. And so we didn't just think about the font sizes, we also thought about how does this work with line height? Can we make the combination of font size and line height map to more like whole numbers? Because when you start to get partial numbers, that's when you start to get awkward weirdness with vertical alignment, and you find yourself adding a pixel here and a pixel there, and it gets frustrating. And all designers hate things that are not vertically aligned properly. So behind the design system is all these like kind of microsystems. It's systems built on systems built on systems. And you can think about that for a long, long time and start realizing that you haven't actually done any building because you've been thinking about it too much. So as well as these utilities, we also needed to look at our bigger components. One of the first ones I looked at was our box styles. If you use github.com, you might notice that a lot of the UI is in boxes. And then there's sometimes lists in boxes. And sometimes those boxes have headers and footers. And we had 7 different SAS partials that were styling similar but slightly different boxes. And that's crazy. That's just madness. And they weren't built in a very usable or flexible way. So the next thing we did is to start to audit our components and start to introduce conventions. So we decided to take an object-oriented CSS approach and separate, so that's to separate structure from skin and separate that from location. So avoid using class names that are tied to a specific feature or a specific page. And we used our own variation of BEM syntax so that we could, it would help us like how we structured our styles, but also so that we could look at the markup and know this is a component that belongs to a collection of perhaps other styles, or whether this is a utility and it just does one thing. So it helps us to read the HTML and know what the CSS is doing. Adam Morse talks about this in a really good article called CSS and Scalability. And I think that's really important to becoming fluid at building the front end. If you can internalize the class names and know what stuff is doing without having to go and even inspect or dig around the CSS, then the development workflow gets faster and easier. And so our markup started to look a bit like this. So we could just see, oh, that's a box and it's a large box, and the text is centered and it's green. Now I know what's happening. But that's all great, but you have to have documentation to back that up. You can't expect people to, people will dig around and figure out how stuff works, but we have this kind of principle at GitHub that if it's not documented, it doesn't exist, and many other people will tell you that who've worked on design systems. So we worked on making sure all those styles that needed to be documented were documented, and then we also added on top of that the sort of reasoning behind the system. What were the rules? Why were we doing things a certain way? So that people didn't just have to take that system and go, oh, okay, someone's telling me how to write CSS. They think they're better at this than I am. This helps them understand the same things that we had come to understand. So I think it's really important to share the what and the why behind your system. And so with the combination of these utilities that we could quickly add and people could use straight away, and that they wouldn't have to do things like write more margin and padding for every time they wanted to update a page. With a combination of that and refactoring our components, that meant that just design and development was much faster, and that people rarely had to write CSS to make updates or build out a new page. And that works both for designers and developers. When we're designing systems, we can't just think about one audience. We have to make it for everybody that's working in this system. The thing that I think I learned from this, and I think is sort of my standby principles, is that you have to make sure your styles are highly reusable and flexible. You have to have a clear and consistent naming convention. You don't have to use BEM, you can use what you want, but just make sure it's clear and that people can internalize it and learn it. And you have to have that up-to-date, well-written documentation. It has to help people be able to learn stuff for themselves without bugging everybody. So this is a quote from one of the engineers after he had started using the new styles. And he said he felt like he had superpowers. And he kind of almost didn't want to tell anyone about this new design system because he was afraid they would realize that he wasn't as good and fast as he was appearing to be. I mean, but that's awesome. I want everyone to feel like they have superpowers when they're using a design system. But that was a great start for us. But we've hit some problems as we've been scaling things. And while things like utilities have helped us sort of get ahead and just sort of open up things and make things a little bit faster and easier for everyone, it's probably not going to scale forever. There are some problems with that because we rely on people, having to know which combination of styles to use together to read that documentation. So I think the future we're thinking about is well, what if people didn't have to write that markup? What if those styles were connected already? And that's why most people who work on design systems are pretty excited about things like React.js and pulling stuff into components and having the styles and the markup and the JS together. So we're not there yet, but that's where we kind of want to be. Another problem we have is that right now only 38% of GitHub.com is using our design system. All of it should be using our design system. And as well as that, we also have multiple websites. We don't just have GitHub.com. We have sites like developer.com, developer.github.com. We have a help site. We also have a bunch of marketing sites and our conference sites. And they're not all built on Ruby on Rails. Some of them are Jekyll sites. And, in future, we might want to use other things to build those sites with, some of which have been talked about today. So when we think about our system, it needs to work for many different things. Not just when we build a website, but it needs to work in our design programs. Right now, it's very manual for us to update our Sketch UI kit. There's this cascade of effects. When we update something, we also have to update the documentation. And so we really have to pull this system out, and it has to be make it this single source of truth. And we need to distill it down into its purest form so that it can be used in as many ways as possible. So when and how much, the whole point of my talk, well, probably start building systems before it becomes really painful not to have them. Unfortunately, that's what many companies do. It starts to hurt them, and then they build the system. So for GitHub, this is a really accurate timeline of events. But basically, it got to the point where the team was big enough and enough people had been touching the code base that it was starting to become slow to work in the front end. And the combination of some people feeling that pain and some people being willing, enthusiastic, and passionate to start to work and solve those problems is how we started to form a design systems team. And we, in the early stages of a design systems team, it's really important to do things that, solve the biggest pain points fast and make an impact, because you do need to win friends and influence how people write CSS. So that's how things happened at GitHub. We had to feel a bit of pain before enough people were like, right, we need to do something about it. Try not to let it get to that state in your company. Some of you may have seen Airbnb released a React Sketch app this Monday, I think it was. John Gold wrote a great article about it, and if you want to know more about design systems and that approach, definitely read it. And this is, I really resonated with a lot of the article, and he said, the inefficiencies that a medium-sized team can roll with are catastrophically wasteful for a team of our size. And GitHub are like somewhere in between that sort of medium-sized team and getting to the point where if we really don't figure this stuff out, it's going to just be a huge time suck. It's just going to make a huge negative impact on our workflow. So design systems are for solving these types of things once, so that engineers and designers can work on bigger problems. Designers should be working on like, what's the right user experience here? What can really solve this problem? And engineers should be working on like, how can we make this infrastructure faster, more performant, more secure? Not figuring out what button color should it be and like, how do I write this CSS? So I really believe that you can start with systems, because systems are in themselves, like, they should be built for change, because your product is always going to be evolving and changing, and someone's going to decide this brand isn't right and we need these new colors over here. So you can start by like defining some color variables and defining a typography style, because actually even if you have a small system, that's still easier to update if you have one source of truth than it is to go through and edit individual lines of CSS or however you want to style things. So sorry if you wanted a better answer to this question, but I think, when do you need design systems? Now. And you should build as much as you need when you need it, and just try and stay ahead of that like really painful area. Thank you.